Hey everybody, this is the Thinking Read podcast. I am Tom Vieira. You can find more episodes from this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. In this episode, I got the chance to sit down with Dr. Graham Tomlin. He is president of St. Mellitus College in London. He is editor-in-chief of Seen and Unseen, as well as author of various books, including a book on Blaise Pascal. It is called Blaise Pascal, the Man Who Made the Modern World. He is one of the world's leading experts on Blaise Pascal. This is a fascinating interview. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks so much for being here. Graham, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to be with you, Tom. Thanks for the invitation and looking forward to the conversation too.
Maybe let's begin with what drew you to Pascal to begin with. I know you have a background in Luther, if I'm not mistaken. I saw that. And so this is not too far-fetched for you, but still, why, of all the thinkers, why Blaise Pascal?
Yeah, well, I got into Pascal originally when I think I was a teenager. I think I first read the Pensée, and as you do as a angst sort of filled teenage young man, I remember reading it and finding it really quite a compelling read. Not that I understood much of it at that stage, but there was enough in it to really generate my, to pique my interest. And then later on, when I was, I'd done a theology degree here in Oxford. And I was beginning to explore what would I do for my doctoral research after that. And I kind of fixed on this idea of Luther, a theme in Martin Luther's thought called the theology of the cross. But I didn't want to just study Luther. I wanted to kind of put that in the frame of other people. So I thought I'd do that in relation to St. Paul and his writings in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, about how the cross is both the wisdom and the foolishness of God. And then I was thinking, is there another figure who kind of deals with this theme? And at the time, I was rereading the Pensée, and it suddenly struck me as I read the Pensée that this is kind of a big theme for Pascal. The idea of the cross is not just the way in which God reconciles people to himself, but as a kind of key criterion for knowing God, that somehow the cross is a key to knowing the kind of God that we're talking about. Anyway, so I ended up doing my doctoral research on St. Paul, Luther, and Pascal. And to be honest, at that stage, I kind of put Pascal to one side, partly because I needed a job. And within, theological colleges and seminaries, people generally tend to want teaching on Luther, not on Pascal. But I always promised myself one day I'd return to Pascal. And I wanted to write a biography of him because I found his life and his personality absolutely fascinating and thought this needs... a story needs telling, and there hadn't been a kind of major English biography for 20, 30 years, and so I was able to return to it in the last few years and get back into Pascal, and so really that's the kind of origins of the book.
He really does have a fascinating life, short life, but a brilliant life. We'll get into that a little bit. So in the title of your book, it's a striking claim. You say he's the man who made the modern world. And so I'm wondering maybe if you could just flesh that out for us a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think the reason why I hit on that title, and as you say, it is a rather bold claim, but it seems to me that many of the things that we just take for granted in our modern world have Pascal's fingerprints all over them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, imagine for a moment, you get up in the morning and you maybe look at your watch, and you check the time, you go downstairs, you have your breakfast, you maybe open your laptop and you answer a few emails, check a few websites, maybe check the weather, what's going to be like that day. Maybe there's a bit of post comes into the door, and there's a letter from your insurance company telling you what your insurance premiums are for your life insurance, for your car insurance. And you read it and you have your breakfast, you go out, you get a bus, and you can travel into work. Okay, that day you've been up, I don't know, 3-4 hours. Pretty well everything you've done so far that day has been touched by Pascal. Because, going back over it, he was one of the first people in Europe to wear his timepiece on his wrist rather than just in his pocket. He He had a large part in the kind of development of the barometer, the idea of air pressure. He did some groundbreaking experiments showing that air has weight, that air weighs something. It's not just a kind of nothing. He also did experiments into the nature of the vacuum. He did a lot of work on, he invented this calculating machine, which was one of the first mechanical calculating machines that actually worked, that did addition and subtraction and division up to tens, hundreds of millions. And it actually really did function well. And so when the story of the computer is often told, the story to our digital age, Pascal's machine, the Pascaline as it was called, is often cited as part of that story. So he had a big hand in the creation of the computer. He did a lot of work on probability theory. He's often thought of as one of the inventors of probability theory. And probability theory underlies insurance. When your insurance company works out your premiums, it's trying to work out, what's the probability of you living a certain length of time or having an accident in your car. That's basically based on Pascal's work. And also he invented buses. Towards the end of his life, he had this idea about urban transportation to help particularly the poor people of Paris travel from one side to the other. And he came up with this idea of carriages, and a company that would buy up a series of carriages, would go from point A to point B, stop at various points along the way. You could get on by a very small amount, and you could travel as a way of making poor people able to travel across increasingly growing cities like Paris at the time in the 17th century. So those are just a sample of the kind of things that Pascal did. And that's not saying anything about his impact on philosophy and theology and so on. Right. But he's one of the people who, made the modern world, had his fingerprints over so many of the things that we take for granted in our world today.
Goodness, that's fascinating. And the fact that he died so young, 39 years old, right? And that he was so sickly during much of his life that he was able to accomplish that much is remarkable. I don't know if I quite know of somebody else that comes to mind that has that sort of combination of qualities. And so many things we take for granted, you're right. You can trace them straight back to his own life.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a word that's often used of Pascal is that he's a real polymath.
Yeah.
In a way that, and I think the reason why, so he's a philosopher, he's a theologian, he's an inventor, he's a mathematician, he's a physicist. He does all these things, and I suppose that's partly because, I mean, in one sense, maybe the sum of human knowledge was smaller then than it is now. It was possible to be a generalist in a way that it's less so now. I think it's also because in those days, the boundaries between those things were not quite as hard as they are now. These days, you kind of had to decide early on, are you going to be a scientist or on the humanities side? Are you going to be a mathematician or a physicist? Are you going to be a philosopher or a theologian? Well, actually, the boundaries between those things were not that sort of rigid. So you get a number of figures like that. So René Descartes, for example, the great sort of 17th century, actually contemporary of Pascal's, a little bit older than Pascal. He is also a sort of philosopher, was interested in science, in kind of experimentation, in sort of physics at the same time. So that's partly why, but he did have this extraordinary mind. And one of the things that he was able to do is he's on the one hand a kind of maybe a kind of geeky mathematician, a sort of scientist guy, but he can also write beautiful prose. He was also very funny. He wrote these letters called the Provincial Letters, which are a satire on the Jesuits of his time, and they genuinely are funny, even though the details of the debate, to our mind, seem rather kind of abstruse and very kind of recondite and historical. But even still, the way he writes them really kind of raises a smile even today. So he had this genius at comedy. He was a kind of feisty arguer with people. He had this great gift of language, a kind of penetrating mind when it came to science and mathematics. And so he did have an extraordinary range of capacity of abilities. And as you say, crammed into a very short life. Died just aged 39 in 1662.
Because as I read through your book and have it right here, precocious comes to mind, at least, maybe in the earlier phases of his life. He's sort of kind of an upstart and a child prodigy and these sorts of things. And it just seems what strikes me as interesting, and what I want to get to next is the night of fire that he has, this vision, because it seemed for all the world like he was heading in the same direction that, let's say, like a Descartes would be heading in, or, it's sort of, he is one of the most important mathematicians and scientists ever to have lived. And yet he has this night of fire experience. And I'm just really intrigued by this. Could you maybe explain a bit about why it's so significant for him. Is this the experience that really was most important for his entire life? It seems that way from your book.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very significant time for him, and it maybe helps to kind of understand some of the background to it. I mean, Pascal was
Yeah.
born into a relatively normal Catholic family in
Hmm.
France in the 17th century, and he kind of grew up in this family that was a very nominal Catholic faith. I mean, real, genuine, but nothing particularly outstanding about it. The family had an encounter with a kind of renewal movement within French Catholicism, which was called Jansenism. And that was largely through an event where his father had an accident. They brought in a couple of bone setters, is what you do. He dislocated his hip. And what you did is you brought the bone setters to kind of manipulate your bones back into place. Sounds rather painful. And these bone setters were Jansenists. And Jansenism was a kind of spiritual movement, about an intense, quite austere kind of Christianity, Christian devotion. And they sort of set about not just setting the bones of the father, but also setting the souls of the children. Pascal had two sisters, his older sister Gilberte, the younger sister Jacqueline, and these bone setters spoke to them and their father about the Christian life. And about this particular form of devotion. Pascal's mother had died when he was 3 years old, so she wasn't on the scene. So Pascal was sort of drawn partially into this Jansenist movement, and was on the fringes of that for quite some time. But then his kind of, if you like, his career, his fame took off. He did a number of experiments on the existence of the vacuum, as I was mentioning earlier on. That kind of went viral around Europe. He became this famous mathematician and this philosopher, and he enters into what sometimes scholars in the past have called his worldly period, his période mondaine. Yeah. And I think sometimes it's a little bit overblown, but it seems that he was drawn into the life of the salons in Paris and being sort of feted around. And, this was a world of witty conversation, of, kind of affluence, of enjoyment of life, and, mixing with the kind of high important people of his times. Meanwhile, his younger sister, Jacqueline, was drawn really powerfully into the Jansenist movement. So it was always a bit of a tussle in his mind. And I think he always struggled to work out how his calling as a sort of public intellectual, as a scientist, as a physicist, as a sort of famous person in that sense, fitted with his also this pull towards the religious life, towards devotion to God and prayer and so on. And anyway, he's struggling with these things. And then on a particular night, it seems that in November 23rd, 1654, in the middle of these sort of struggles, he's very conscious of it. He has this profound experience, and he dates it precisely. That November 23rd, 10:30 in the evening until past midnight. He seems to have had this time of, maybe he sat down to pray and suddenly had this deep, visceral encounter with God. And he never told anybody about it. No one knew about it at all during his lifetime. The only reason we know about it was because when he died, one of the servants was preparing his body for burial. I cut open his jacket and found this bit of paper inside, which was an account of this experience. And so people, when they read it, they thought, that kind of makes sense. There's something shifted around Pascal's time, around that time. And I think the significance for it is that it was a real deepening of his own spiritual life. And he talks about, the God of Jesus Christ, not the God of the philosophers.
Right.
So it's a kind of departure, if you like, from the God that Descartes was talking about. The God who stands at the end of a sort of syllogistic set of arguments. And he thinks actually that's not the real God. The God that we are talking about is this real, visceral God who talks to us, who approaches us, who demands everything from us. And it did bring about a huge transformation in his life, a total transformation. Sometimes it's portrayed that he gave up his science, gave up his mathematics. He didn't entirely, but they found a different place in his life, and they found, if you like, I think he would say, the right place in his life. Yes, they were important things, but they weren't as important as knowing this God who made him and that summons him and is the most important thing, most important thing in life to discover. And I think it has a number of impacts on him. Number one, two major impacts. One is that he finds a new project, which is to try to convince his worldly friends all about Christianity, which leads to the Pensée. The other is a real fascination for the life of the poor. He becomes very interested in the life of the poor of Paris and in France, and what he can do to relieve the pains of poverty. That leads partly to the buses we were talking about earlier on, but a number of other things as well. So it brought about a whole revolution in his priorities. I mean, it's not a total revolution. It's not a kind of total break where he gives up his past life and adopts a new one, but it's a very significant move for him in pretty identifying the God that he's dealing with.
You know, in one of my earlier episodes on this, I think I mentioned the scholastics. I had wondered a little bit, and maybe you can touch on this. You know, I think of Aquinas' five proofs, for example. They seem fairly rigorous inductive arguments that conclude with this first mover, for example, we call God. Could we read his memorial as partially a response? Would he think of that sort of thing as also among the God of the philosophers and not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for example?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think his target in the language of the God of the philosophers is not so much Aquinas. I think it's more Descartes.
Okay.
Largely because I think Aquinas, in his context, and Aquinas' theological method, I think, is not trying to kind of prove God to skeptics. He's trying to kind of explore the nature of the faith that Christians already have. And so if you have a faith in God, are there good reasons for this faith? And here are 5 reasons why it makes sense to believe in God. That's a very different project from the kind of thing that people like Descartes were about, which is starting from a sort of skeptical point of view, starting from a position of doubt where, you know, Descartes' famous experiment, let's doubt everything we can. Let's doubt everything we can possibly come into our mind until we can find something we cannot doubt. The thing we find that we cannot doubt is the fact that I'm doubting my own thinking self. So therefore, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, and you rebuild things from there. And so Descartes comes up with a kind of proof for God, which he thinks works. But Pascal is not quite so convinced that that really works. There's one of the very shortest of the Pensées is one where Pascal says, he talks about Descartes, he says, Descartes, he says, incertain et inutile. In other words, Descartes, uncertain and useless. But he's not very complimentary. And I think what he means by that is he sums up quite a lot of his attitude to Descartes and this idea of the God of the philosophers, a God that you can somehow find proofs for, and you can believe in him because you can find a rational proof. It's uncertain because he thinks that the kind of certainty that Descartes is looking for is actually impossible for us to find. We can't find that level of certainty. We can't find 100% proof of God. And that's largely because, and this may be a theme we want to explore a little bit more, God actually hides himself from that kind of proof. He doesn't give that kind of proof. But then there's useless at the same time. He thinks actually this God that Descartes thinks he's found and has given proofs for actually doesn't change your life. It's just a kind of idea. It's an abstraction, something that you kind of think, yes, I agree, there is a God. You tick that off and you get on with your life. Whereas for Pascal, God is a very different kind of God. There's a one of the Pensées talks about how the God of the Christians is a God of love and compassion. He's a God who fills the heart and soul of those who he possesses. He's a God who makes them inwardly aware of their own wretchedness and his infinite mercy. He unites himself with them in the depths of their soul, who makes them incapable of having any other end but him. This is a deeply personal God. Someone who kind of captures your mind, your body, your soul, changes everything, rather than just an argument at the end of a set of syllogisms. And so I think that's where his target is, I think. So it's not that he has no room for reason. He thinks there are good reasons for believing in God. And part of the reason why he thinks they don't help is that psychologically they don't really work very well. You can convince yourself one day that there is a God. The next day, the weather's bad and your digestion's in a funny state, and you think, well, was I right? Do those arguments really work? And actually, we're also driven more by our desires and our longings than our logic. Our heart is stronger than our heads, if you like, and therefore, psychologically, we're not really capable of arriving at an understanding of God through the use of reason, because reason has its limits, and because our desires are stronger than our rational capacity. All those sort of lines.
It reminds me of that famous statement: that what our hearts love, our wills choose, and our reason justifies.
Yeah,
Um, you know,
yeah,
yeah,
which is
yeah,
classic. Yeah.
right, right. You know, when I think of the Pascal versus Descartes comparison, is sort of the difference between engaging an idea versus engaging a being.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And a
fundamentally,
person. Yeah,
yeah, a
exactly. Yeah,
person, right? A fundamentally
yeah.
different kind of experience altogether. So I think this leads me, I don't know, my thinking, this leads me to the wager because, when
Mm,
I shared it in a previous episode that I I never really thought much of the wager. That's about the only thing that I knew about Pascal besides a bit of his
mm,
genius mathematically, scientifically, but
mm,
I'd never really been all that impressed. And then I read the Pensée and I sort of realized that I had made some mistakes about how I
mm,
understood it. So I would love to get your thoughts on the wager, just maybe
mm,
briefly what it is, but does it work?
mm, mm. Yeah, I think you're right. I think the wager is a very often misunderstood argument. It's often the thing that people know about Pascal. You need to talk about Pascal. People often think, oh, Pascal's wager. I've heard about that. And people think of it as an argument which is they're trying to kind of somehow prove God or
Right.
to talk about the benefits of believing in God. You might as well believe in God um, because it's the outcome is going to be better if you believe in God than if you don't. And in other words, they think it's an argument that is trying to kind of strong arm people into belief by saying the benefits of belief are better than the benefits of unbelief. I actually don't think it works that way, and I mean, maybe we're just going through how I think the argument actually works in Pascal's mind. Um, as I mentioned earlier on, he done this work on probability,
Right.
um, and part of it was about games. A lot of his friends were into games of cards or tossing coins or whatever, and they would bet on the games. He had a lot of friends. Gambling was a big thing in sort of mid 17th century France, the kind of circles that Pascal moved in. And one of the classic sort of conundrums was, what if you're in the middle of a game and people have bet on the outcome and the game gets interrupted halfway through? How do you allocate the stake?
Hmm.
Um, and some people said, well, you can't because it's just chance. But Pascal thought actually that there are ways of working out the probability of what the game might have ended up at from what's happened so far.
Hmm.
And so he enters into this correspondence with Pierre de Fermat, which is, you may have heard of Fermat's last theorem,
Hmm.
one of the great mathematicians of European life. And they have this correspondence on probability. They come up with the origins of probability theory. And in a way, what Pascal then, when he comes to the wager, he thinks, well, in some ways, what he does is he's kind of talking. It's like a conversation with someone who is thinking about faith and is maybe poised, thinking there's some reasons to believe, maybe some reasons not to believe. What do I do? And Pascal says, well, actually, in some ways, life is a bit like that. Life is a bit like a game which is halfway through, where you don't quite know what the end is going to be. At the end, is there a God? Is there not a God? Is there the prospect of eternal bliss, eternal sort of happiness with God in heaven, or eternal damnation, eternal pain, or just going into nothingness, or whatever it might be? We don't know what the end of the game is, and we're kind of halfway through. We're not at the beginning, but we're not at the end. So again, it's a bit like that. So, and he says that, and so in this conversation, he talks with this friend, and he says, well, life is kind of like that. There is a coin being tossed at the far edge of the universe. It's going to come down heads or tails. Either God exists or God doesn't exist. What are you going to bet? And the guy comes back to him and says, well, do I have to bet? Can't I just be agnostic on it? And Pascal says, well, no, you do have to bet because you've already bet. You're already living your life as if God exists or as if God doesn't exist. You've already bet. The question is, are you going to change sides? And then the guy says, well, okay, if I've already bet, well, is there any evidence to push me one way or the other? And Pascal says, well, there kind of is, but it's not 100%. It's not totally compelling for the reasons we talked about earlier on, that, we are psychologically incapable of having a purely rational approach to kind of evidence in that kind of way. Our desires and what we want to be true influence us a huge amount. And so the guy said, well, what do I do? And that's when Pascal says, well, let's do the probability. And he says, well, okay, let's work out the odds here. If you believe that God doesn't exist, if you bet on that side and you're right, well, you haven't gained a great deal. because you live this life, you have a few pleasures, but then you go into nothingness at the end of the life. You haven't really gained a great deal. If you're wrong, you stand to lose quite a bit, because there's the prospect of eternal damnation or eternal nothingness or whatever. That's a big risk to take. Whereas if you bet on God does exist and you're wrong, well, again, you haven't lost a great deal. Maybe a little bit of sacrifice in this life. There are even some benefits in the Christian life anyway, and you'll go into nothingness anyway. But if you're right, you stand to have a huge windfall, because you will die and you go into the presence of God and eternal happiness forever. So if you were purely doing the probability, you'd always bet on God. And then the guy comes back and says, okay, well, I get that, but I can't make myself believe something I don't believe. And that's when Pascal says, yeah, I get that. You can't make yourself believe something you don't kind of feel. But he says, this is the point of the wager. At least get it into your head that the reason you don't believe is not because of your reason, it's because of your passions. In other words, if you were really being rational, if you were really being logical, if you were really following your reason, you'd always bet on belief, because the odds are far better on that way. But the reason you don't do that is because you don't really want to. There's something else going on than just your reason. So it's an argument about the limits of reason. It's an argument about the ways in which we make those crucial decisions about our eternity and God and so on. He's trying to uncover the real reasons for the belief or unbelief that we have. So it's a very limited argument. It's not trying to kind of shoehorn people into belief. It's helping people to get to the position where they're able to make a good choice and realize what's really going on in those key decisions about God, eternity, heaven, hell, and everything else.
Right. There's something ambivalent about the evidence that we have that, he says one line that struck me when I read the Pensée is, there's too much to deny and not enough to confirm with respect to God's existence. And so it's kind of against that backdrop, right? You must wager, and you can't really give this sort of, 100% airtight argument for God. That was one of the, when I really didn't like the idea of having to wager, right? When I first encountered this argument, I thought, that's sort of an odd way to put the whole thing. And, but I think you really have to see some of the framework of the Pensée, which is quite often what's missed in the conversations on this. So we maybe have a few more minutes to chat about the Pensée. I want to maybe Pascal's understanding of the heart, because this what you were just saying. So he says we don't perceive God by way of reason. That seems to be a presupposition leading into the wager, let's say, but we do perceive God by the heart. He has, the famous statement that the heart has its reasons, of which reason knows nothing. So I suppose, when I read the Pensée, it seems like he links the heart to some kind of intuitive faculty. It's not so much an emotional thing or something. Maybe could you speak to just what's the right way to understand Pascal on the heart?
Yeah, you're right. He does have this kind of opposition, if you like, or this relationship between the reason and the heart. And as you say, his famous line, the heart has its reasons, of which reason knows nothing. Or another line is, the most important thing a reason does is to know its own limits. The reason is a great gift. He's not an anti-rationalist. He's not a fideist. He's not someone who doesn't believe in reason at all. After all, he's a scientist. He believes in evidence. He's one of the pioneers of evidential scientific discovery of the experimental method. So he believes that reason has a real place. It's just that he believes that reason is not the right tool to understand God. It might be the right tool to understand the world and the physical creation that we've been given, but it's not the right tool to understand God. He says God is known by the heart and not the reason. And you're right, that the heart for him is a kind of deep instinct that we have, a deep instinct, which is kind of in some ways not under our control. And that kind of feeds into his kind of Augustinian idea. Great theological master, St. Augustine, for whom, we only come to believe in God when God touches our heart with his grace and enables us to see something of the beauty of God. And so, which is why, it's why also Pascal talks about God as this big theme for him, the hiddenness of God. That God is hidden. Back to your line about there's too much to deny and not enough to convince. God seems to sort of hide himself, and this is an observation Pascal makes about when you look at the world, God is not obvious. He doesn't shout at you when you walk down the street. There's not some sort of God-shaped thing in the corner. Other things are obvious, trees and mountains and houses and people, but God is not obvious. God seems to hide himself. That seems to be the nature of things. There are reasons that might push you towards belief, but then there are other things that might make you think, well, maybe there isn't a God because I can't see him, I can't feel him, and so on. And so he says, if there is a God in the world, it must be a hidden God, which I think is a really interesting idea.
Yeah.
Because a lot of atheists kind of will come and say, well, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence for God? And a lot of Christians will try to bring up evidence for God. And Pascal thinks actually that doesn't really help you very much, because he says really, if there is a God, it's not a matter of either there's an obvious God or there is no God. Those aren't the two obvious. Those aren't the two options. There is a third option, that there is a God, but he's a hidden God, a God who deliberately hides himself. And that's where I think Pascal, this idea of the heart comes in, because it helps him to see, well, you don't access this God through reason. And so when he talks about the hidden God, he talks, well, if there is a hidden God, what religion proclaims a hidden God? And he's actually quite interested in comparative religion. He talks quite a lot about Islam and about Judaism. But he actually makes this really interesting point. He says, well, actually, at the heart of Christianity, the heart of the revelation of God, Christians say that the place where God is most clearly revealed is in the person of Jesus Christ. But he says, even there, God is hidden, because you could meet Jesus in the flesh, you could shake his hand, you could encounter him on the streets of Palestine in the first century and entirely miss the fact that you were talking to God. Even in Jesus Christ, God is hidden in the flesh of Jesus Christ. Even in something he says, he's a good Catholic. He believes that in the Mass, the bread and the wine of the Holy Communion, Christ is really present. But he's present in hidden form. It looks like bread and wine. It tastes like bread and wine. It's not obvious. And so he says there's a kind of fit here between what we observe in the world, that God is not obvious. There are reasons to believe in him, but he doesn't make himself plain. He's a hidden God, and the way in which God reveals himself in Christianity, which is always hidden. So he kind of thinks those two bits of the jigsaw fit together. Our observation of the world as a scientist that says, you can't see God and put him in a test tube and analyze him. Therefore, he's a hidden God, and the way in which Christianity talks about God, even in the heart of its revelation. And so that's one of his arguments he uses. And so I think that's kind of what he means by the heart, and what he means by, how we access God through the heart, not through reason.
There's been books, and that the heart has its reasons, right? There's been things written about this that seem to sort of carry out this more romantic idea that the heart has this sort of emotional
and he's not
guidance.
Exactly. He's not talking about emotion versus reason.
Right.
He's not talking about kind of romantic, the heart leads you on, the kind of, Celine Dion songs or Disney films about,
Right.
the heart knows everything. It's not about romance. It's not about imagination. It's not about emotion. It's about this deep instinct that we have, that there is something behind what we see. There is a hidden God out there, and he wants to kind of help people to discover that God. And reasons can help in that, but they can't fully take you there in the end.
Right. And it just seems to me as, it's kind of read your book and been paying attention to some discussion out there, that something of a resurgence perhaps in interest in Pascal, perhaps because the debates about God seem to be as lively as ever, and Pascal seems to he ages well, it seems to me, in terms of philosophers, right? He seems to always come back and have something to say about these dialogues.
I think you're right. I think he speaks to our modern age in a very
Yeah.
powerful way. When I did a debate recently with another scholar who was kind of representing Descartes, and I was representing Pascal, and he was kind of making the point that Descartes is a much more significant figure historically in philosophy than Pascal. But I was kind of saying, well, actually, Pascal's approach is a bit of a sort of depth charge. Maybe it didn't have an impact in the time, but it speaks very powerfully to our age today. He talks about, how he's living in an age where, the telescope has recently been invented. I mean, we kind of know about the vastness of space, and he sort of sees the smallness of humanity within the vastness of the stars and the planets, which speaks to our kind of modern age. A lot of his descriptions of the human condition.
Okay, so Graham, I want to go back to this this idea of Descartes and Pascal. You point out at one point in your book, I thought it was very interesting, and I believe it's in the Night of Fire chapter, but you talk about how both of them uh, have this idea of sitting alone in
Mm,
a room, and and yet they come out very different.
mm,
So and I didn't know this, that Descartes actually had that, where he gets the cogito and whatnot. What, he was only 23, I believe you'd point out in your book. He's a young man, but in any case, what's the key contrast there between the
mm.
two when it comes to sitting alone quietly in a room?
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways of answering that. I think one is historically, they both have these experiences of sitting alone in a room, trying to kind of work out what's going on around them and thinking about God and so on.
Right.
Descartes comes out with an argument. Um, I think, therefore I am. Uh, and the thing that guarantees my own thinking is God, and a kind of version of Anselm's ontological argument.
Right.
And Pascal has an encounter with God, this personal, encounter with a person, and that's a very different thing. So they do come up with very different sort of solutions to it. I think the other interesting thing about Pascal and sitting in rooms is his famous statement that the root of all our problems as human beings is our inability to stay quietly in a room.
Right.
And I think that's, again, is another fascinating approach he has. He says, actually, one of the big themes in Pascal is the kind of question: how do we find happiness? He says, every human being wants to be happy. Nobody sets out to be miserable. We all want to be happy, absolutely, with no exceptions. But the reality is that happiness eludes us. We find a moment of happiness and it slips through our fingers. And most of our experience of life is actually of regret of the past, or of anxiety for the future, or disappointment, or friction, or whatever it might be, with occasional moments of happiness sort of built into that. And he says, well, there's this kind of emptiness inside, this deep brokenness inside each human person. But he says, actually, we cover it up pretty successfully. And we cover it up through another big theme of Pascal's: distraction. We
Right.
play games, and we have conversations, and we think of things to think about. We do everything to kind of avoid this sense of the emptiness inside.
The gamble.
And
He talks about
exactly.
gambling, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and he says, if you doubt that, there's a real depth of emptiness and brokenness inside you, try this experiment. Try sitting in a room on your own with nothing to distract you, no books, no podcasts, nothing to listen to, no one to talk to. Just sit on your own for an hour. Try it. He says it's almost impossible. And the minute you try and do that, you will reach for some
Right.
distraction. In our day, we reach for our phones. With the moment we still start feeling bored, we're unable to do that, because if we do sit on our own, it uncovers the emptiness inside. And that's, again, one of the other distinctions between him and Descartes. Descartes' not really conscious of that, whereas Pascal, I think, is aware of that. And that speaks, I think, very much to the modern condition, the sense that many people are deeply aware of that kind of brokenness within the human soul, but also within the kind of where we are as a culture in the kind of Western world right now. And Pascal speaks to that and kind of resonates with it in a way that he speaks very powerfully, I think, to our modern moment of sort of anxiety, of fear, of regret, but also giving a hope that in that moment you might find what Pascal found, this encounter with a God who fills his soul with joy and contentment and peace, and gives him a promise of a life beyond this one, and that brought him the kind of peace that he found towards the end of his life. And so that's why I think Pascal speaks very powerfully to our modern moment.
Yeah. They seem to have gone into that quiet room with very different expectations, right? Like,
Yeah,
Descartes going in there trying to once and for all settle
yeah,
with mathematical certainty philosophical problems, almost in a, I don't know, um, scientific method kind of way.
yeah.
Um, Whereas, Pascal, as I read Pascal, he doesn't say, when we go quietly into a room, we find ourselves with all these temptations to be distracted. We don't just give ourselves to distractions. At one point, he has a striking passage where he seems to be arguing that it's contrary to nature. It's unnatural in some sense to not give thought to your eternal fate, as it were. So we don't, it's not a good thing just to give ourselves to distractions. It's sort of a moment of genuine, almost you might say existential thought about your life
Yeah.
and eternity after, which is a very different sort of goal than it seems to me Descartes had. for entering that room. Probably has a lot
Yeah.
to do with why they come out quite differently.
Mm.
That's very helpful, the way you put that. With Descartes on one side, it seems like, is it right to read the Pensée where there's Descartes on one side and there's also Montaigne on the other side, right? Descartes, the great rationalist, and Montaigne, I mean, he seems like he's very fun to read. He's very enjoyable. He's a wild, but he's a little bit of a self-absorbed, skeptic.
Mm.
Is that a fair summary? So maybe speak a little bit about the Montaigne side
Mm. Mm.
of the influence on Pascal's thinking and on the Pensée in particular.
Yeah, I think Pascal's thought often positions itself between these two poles, and he sees Descartes and Montaigne as exemplars of two broad strands of philosophy, human philosophy, Western philosophy. One is the broadly rationalist tradition that is very confident about human reason, its capacity to understand the world. It gave birth to the scientific method. Of course, Pascal was very involved in the kind of origins of that whole rationalist stream of thought. But on the other side, you've got this very strong skeptical scheme of thought, which dates back to Greek philosophy, but it finds its main expression in Pascal's time in the thought of Michel de Montaigne, whose great question is: so if Descartes is cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. That's my kind of grounds for rationality. Montaigne's great statement is, que sais-je? What do I know?
Right. What do I know?
Not even I don't know anything. It's what do I know? I can't know anything for sure. Everything's custom. Everything's up for grabs. And that, again, kind of speaks to our age as well. We're kind of caught between kind of rationalist, scientific, Richard Dawkins, we can understand everything by the scientific method. And then the kind of postmodern, there is no such thing as truth. Everything's up for grabs. Everything can be deconstructed. Everything can be reconstructed in our own image. And you're kind of poised between two things. And Pascal maps that onto human experience. That on the one hand, yes, we do have an amazing capacity to understand the world. There is the scientific method. Our capacity to do mathematics and physics and philosophy and so on is enormous. We have this capacity for beauty, for creativity, for conversation, for language. And yet, on the other hand, we have this enormous capacity for destruction, for harm, for negativity, he says all men naturally hate each other, the competition that we have underlying it. We said, well, how do you make sense of this thing? Descartes speaks to the confident rationality, Montaigne speaks to the kind of dark side of human life, the kind of fact we don't know anything for sure. And he says that the thing that makes sense of that is the Christian doctrine of creation and fall, that we are both gloriously created by God in his image, with minds that have the capacity to understand the world which God has made. That's our created nature, but we're also fallen. We have fallen from that standing. We've turned away from the God who made us. And that kind of explains the dark side of humanity, our inability to know anything for sure, our, the dark motives that comes into it. And so he kind of just portrays Christian faith as providing something which explains this polarity between rationalism and skepticism. Descartes and Montaigne, which is a very clever way of arguing it. And I think that's one of the great sort of creative ways in which Pascal sort of navigates the kind of broad strands of Western philosophy in the tradition that it had.
Right. He gives that argument for the fall straight from a kind of existential sort of reflection. We have this longing for beauty and truth, but we can't have it. Or it's momentary, and only the fall, the Christian doctrine of the fall, can account for something like that, which is it's really, really interesting.
Yeah. And then, of course, he ends with a very hopeful note, because he says that not only does Christian faith offer you a diagnosis that helps to explain why there are rationalists and why there are skeptics and why neither is the whole story. He also says that actually your Christian faith provides a savior, a mediator in the person of Jesus Christ, who redeems us from our brokenness and our fullness, and fills our hearts with joy and contentment and peace and so on. So ultimately, it's a hopeful vision. It's not just a sort of rather gloomy diagnosis of the human condition, although it is in some ways that, but it offers something more than that. Christian faith is a means of redemption and of salvation, which many people over the years, and I keep on bumping into people who've found faith through Pascal, is a powerful way of articulating those kinds of issues and a way through them.
It's interesting. You had mentioned something about the contemporary relevance of Pascal. You brought up Dawkins, and we could talk about, people like Alex O'Connor and others who are kind of out there and raising questions and searching out these sorts of things. And it's interesting because something like, let's just say, quantum mechanics, right? Quantum, and it seems the closer that we look when we peel back the skin of
Mm,
nature, as it were, and we kind of look at, try to get an up close view of what is there, the more and more difficult it seems for reason, and something that's purely scientific to say we can grasp it, what things really are. There's, Pascal has, a line where he says, it's reason's task to
mm.
get us to the point where we know that there's infinity afterward, and
Mm.
we know our
Yeah,
limits at that moment, right? There's something, sort of, there's almost a hard truth that we always have to rediscover every generation when it comes to that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And the relations between those two things are really, it's always quite close. I mean, at one point he says, we know the truth not only through our reason, but also through our heart. So it's not these things are two
Right.
opposites to each other.
Right.
That you need both of these things. You need to pay attention to the heart. You need to pay attention to desire, what you want to be true. What you want to be true may not necessarily be true. Um, and he says he wants to arouse in people the desire to find the truth, aware of how much passion, emotion, desire uh, inflects and determines to a certain extent our ability to grasp truth. We have to realize how far our knowledge is clouded by our passions. And so it's a kind of epistemology, it's a kind of way of
Right.
understanding how things really are. And I think he's a really great guide to anybody today who's trying to kind of work out an approach to faith, to God, to philosophy, and so on. So I think, as you say, he's one of the great figures for our age. I think that speaks to our times like very few others do.
Graham, thank you so much for joining me today. This was a delightful conversation, and I truly appreciate your time. And maybe we can catch more time another time down the road. I'm going to take up
Yep.
Montaigne and probably on the way to Descartes. I really would like to
Yep.
look a little bit more closely at what Descartes has to say. But again, I really appreciate your help and your work. And Graham Tomlin's book is Blaise Pascal, The Man Who Made the Modern World. I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic read. Our question is to think or not to think. I'm so glad you're with us. Bye for now.